Once upon a time, somebody probably told you that the U.S. federal government consists of three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. You probably learned that the legislative branch writes the laws, that the executive branch implements those laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. That's not entirely wrong, but it's not a very helpful way to think about policymaking. It certainly doesn't give you much insight into how to engage with the policymaking process. In any policy decision, there are typically a number of government entities involved, not just one, as well as entities outside of the government. You may think that policymakers in Congress and government agencies spend a lot of their time trying to craft creative solutions to pressing policy problems. But in reality, often they're just digesting policy proposals that were developed by outside groups. As a result, it's misleading to think of policy as something made by different branches of government in some kind of linear fashion.
Here we'll offer a metaphor, that of a policy ecosystem. This image is meant to capture the fact that policymaking involves many entities who interact with each other, and that the outcome of these interactions can be complex and even unpredictable. We'll tell you about the most important organisms in the policy ecosystem, what motivates them, and how they interact. And, as we'll discuss later, the policy ecosystem is different for different policy questions. Healthcare doesn't involve the same entities as housing policy. There are many inhabitants in any policy ecosystem. On the government side, as we'll discuss in other videos, entities typically include the Congress, the White House, the executive branch departments and agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and state and local governments. But these organizations aren't the only ones that matter. One important entity is the private sector. Companies and groups of companies employ lobbyists and fund corporate interest groups to shape policy development. There are lots of other entities that also lobby for policy goals: non-governmental organizations, advocacy groups, unions, professional associations, and the like. The media also play an important role because they can shine a spotlight on policy problems, advertise potential solutions, and generally make government officials look good or bad. Media attention to a particular issue may open windows of opportunity to move policy that may not exist otherwise. Organizations called think tanks also play a role in developing policy ideas. And finally, full-time academics can play a role in the process, providing evidence that can underpin policy decisions.
As a hypothetical example, let's imagine the policy ecosystem surrounding the regulation of a certain chemical compound that might adversely affect human health. We'll call it evil toxin Z. Obviously, one of the major entities in this ecosystem would be the federal agency that sets safe levels for Z. In this case, let's assume that's the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, an executive branch agency that reports to the president, and that it has the authority to regulate this chemical. The congressional committees that oversee the EPA will try to influence how it uses its authority. The White House, senior officials in the EPA, and experts there will also have their own ideas. And outside of government, there will be industries that lobby both Congress and the EPA with proposals of their own. These may be industries that make Z, or those that use a lot of Z. But they may also be industries that make alternatives to Z, or even gear that protects people from Z. And further afield, there could be other private sector players too, such as insurance companies who will see new claims depending on how the health effects from Z are characterized, trial lawyers who want to see those claims grow, and so on. And then, of course, there'll be the environmental advocacy organizations, presumably pushing for tighter regulations on Z. And probably a think tank or two peddling a theory about the most efficient way to regulate toxic chemicals. And we haven't even talked about the state regulatory agencies, who may play a huge role: local governments, community groups, others, etc. All of these entities are talking to and past each other. As you can see, even in this simplified hypothetical example, the policy ecosystem quickly becomes quite complex.
So where do you fit in? As an expert on the health effects of Z, you play a role that is both crucial and limited. It is crucial because none of the other entities in the ecosystem has much of an incentive to get the facts right or to provide dispassionate advice on whether and how to regulate Z. Take industry, for example. The companies that make Z realize that they will lose money if production of it is banned or more strictly regulated. They may also have to lay off some of their employees, which means the labor unions in that industry will likely get involved. The same probably holds for companies that want to buy a lot of Z. They don't want the prices to go up. On the other hand, the companies that make an alternative to Z will want it banned, even if Z isn't necessarily that harmful. The elected officials in this ecosystem, of course, must balance these competing claims and their own preferences. How a particular congressman acts may depend a lot on whether his district contains a factory that makes Z, how many people that factory employs, and so forth. Or, on the other hand, on whether he has a factory in his district that makes an alternative to Z, or a community that, for whatever reason, is particularly vulnerable to the health effects of this toxic chemical. Rarely is there a single right answer. Instead, there are competing interests and values that the policy process must somehow aggregate. And that's how your role is limited. Science may be able to quantify the health risks from a toxin like Z, but it can't say what health risks society should be willing to tolerate and at what costs, or most importantly, who should bear the costs. Now, as an expert on Z, how can you influence the regulatory debate? Well, bear in mind that none of the other entities in the ecosystem is likely to read peer-reviewed journals or to reach out to academics on their own. At best, they may provide some kind of forum for experts to submit comments. You will need to make sure that your results of your research are understood by the entities in this ecosystem. Otherwise, all of the work you've done on Z simply won't matter in the end.
Before we discuss how to engage effectively with the relevant stakeholders, you'll want to have some background on the most important ones. In particular, we'll focus on the federal bureaucracy and Congress.